Working Man Investor. Today's video I'm going to discuss an article called GM to invest $4 billion in US plants amid tariffs in Mexico. So this article is very similar to the one I did a while back about the Honda Civic plants being moved and production to the United States. I've been on record as saying the Cantillion Effect will not allow us to bring manufacturing back in mass to this country. We will add some manufacturing jobs. But unfortunately, we're not going to go back to the 50s and the 60s simply because America's standard of living has gotten so high. The American worker is so expensive. We cannot produce things cheaply enough to sell in the global economy. That's what Mexico and Vietnam and China and Malaysia are doing. So we can produce it and we can sell it here in the United States at an elevated price to the American consumer who is wealthier. But in order to really bring manufacturing to boom, we really need to be able to sell to the foreign buyer, which means we have to be able to export. We have to be able to sell to Canada, China, Mexico, Europe in mass. That's how you bring back manufacturing. But the problem is, like I said, our standard of living is so high, the American worker is so expensive. Plus, we have these steel tariffs going on. When we're talking about automobiles, like we're talking about in this video, these companies have to buy steel from the American steel companies. Domestic steel prices are elevated because of tariffs. They can't bring in the cheaper steel to produce the vehicles cheaper, to sell them not only to us cheaper, but to be able to compete to export. So you're dealing with the American worker who needs a 401k, health insurance, and a high wage to survive. And then you're also dealing with domestic steel companies. Steel that goes in the cars is going to be really expensive. So we're not going to be able to compete and make manufacturing boom because we're not going to be able to sell to the foreign buyer. So again, this article is called GM to invest $4 billion in U.S. plants amid tariffs for Mexico-produced vehicles. General Motors plans to invest $4 billion in American assembly plants, including increasing production of 2 Mexico-produced vehicles in the United States. The automaker said Tuesday there has been few indications of progress in trade talks between the Trump administration and Mexico's leaders about the tariffs, so they're going to go ahead and add some manufacturing here to this country. GM said the investment will add assembly of gas-powered Chevrolet Blazers and Chevrolet Equinox that are currently produced in Mexico to 2 plants in the United States, and convert a large idle plant in Michigan, formerly expected to build all electronic trucks. GM declined to discuss the future of the Mexico plants that currently produce vehicles in Mexico. However, a source familiar with the plans said production of the Blazer will fully move to the U.S. from Mexico, while production of the Equinox is expected to be added to the Mexico plant, which will also produce for other markets. So now this is key, and this is what I've been saying here. And this article only talks about the Equinox, but I found some information on the Blazer too. You have to understand, when these companies are moving manufacturing back to the United States, like they're claiming that they're going to, they're not closing down their other plants in Mexico, because those other plants in Mexico, as I stated at the beginning of this video, produce the vehicle cheaper. That is where they're going to be selling these Equinox to the rest of the world from. That's where they're going to be exporting from. Vehicles made in that Mexico plant or any other plants they have across the world where labor is cheaper. They're not going to be producing vehicles in the United States and exporting in mass to the rest of Europe. Now, I'm not saying there might not be some that end up getting exported, but it will not be at the measure and the length that we need to make manufacturing boom. And it just goes on to say that this investment moves will likely hail as a win for Trump policies and automotive tariffs, which took effect for imported vehicles in April. Look, I'm not taking a shot at President Trump with these videos. Don't want my channel to be political. I just want to explain the economic forces that are in play in all of our economies. It doesn't matter if your economy is capitalist, communist, socialist, it does not matter. The Cantillon Effect, Gresham's Law, Triffin's Dilemma, all of that plays within the economy. So this isn't really a shot at President Trump for trying these tariffs. I just don't think it's, and I'm on record saying it's not going to work because of these economic laws and economic forces. So then they just go on to say that the new investment, which will take place through 2027, will give GM the ability to assemble more than 2 million vehicles per year in the United States. The key there is the ability to produce it. I don't think they're going to produce 2 million vehicles unless 2 million vehicles of that particular model is going to sell within the United States because of the export problem. Now, I did some more digging onto this because a lot of these articles I found didn't say this, and I came across something about talking about General Motors and talking about their plants in Mexico and their plans to manufacture here within the United States. And about the Blazers, because it says in that article about the Equinox, how they're going to keep the Mexico plant open. I wanted to know about the Blazers, and this is what I found. It says, while sources don't explicitly state that these U.S.-made Blazers will be exported, the move is driven by factors including commercial pressures from U.S. tariffs and a commitment to supporting the American automotive industry. This suggests that GM intends for these vehicles to be available both domestic market and potentially for export. That's true. If they have vehicles and they can compete or sell them in the market for some reason, they will. But then this goes on to prove my point. Furthermore, a company source stated that gas-powered Chevy Blazers will continue to be built in Mexico to supply markets outside of America, even as production in the U.S. begins, indicating a strategy for supplying different markets from different manufacturing locations. This is what you want to learn, and it'll help you process the information and become a better investor. Once you understand things like the Cantillon Effect and you start hearing about these manufacturing jobs coming back and everything booming, you're going to understand this and you're going to dig for this information. This right here, they can say they plan on exporting all these vehicles that they want. If they really believe that, they would be closing the Mexico plants, and they're not doing that. They've even said in both of these models that their strategy is to continue to manufacture them in Mexico for the ability to sell from that location. Yeah, to the global economy. They're not going to sell it in the United States now because we have tariffs from Mexico. They're going to produce them here to keep their market share in America. They're going to have to use domestic expensive steel as of now because of the steel tariffs, jack the price up and sell it to us. Then they might eat some of that. They won't turn the profit that they were making by selling from Mexico, but they're going to raise the price, I believe, on these vehicles to make sure it's profitable. So in the end, the consumer really loses. Yeah, we might add some jobs and some tax revenue from these jobs, but overall, we as a consumer, because everybody almost needs cars, are losers. That's the problem with this. So then it says, therefore, based on the available information, it is highly likely that GM will produce the Chevy Blazer in the United States for domestic and exporting starting in 2027. Unlikely. As I've gone through and said, the gas-powered Chevy Equinox and Blazer are currently produced in Mexico. The Equinox will continue to be built in Mexico once production starts in the U.S. facility to order supply outside the North American markets. There it is again, talking about the Equinox still being made in Mexico to sell to Europe, China, etc., whoever else wants it. Mexico's economic minister, Marco, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, said in a social media post he talked with GM and said there is no expectations of any plant closures or layoffs at the automaker's Mexican plants. You got the economic minister of Mexico that has talked to GM, and it's just like how the conversation probably went in whether GM actually said this is, hey man, we're not closing your plant. We're not taking away your jobs. We need your workers to produce these vehicles to sell to the rest of the world. You're just not going to sell them at a discounted price, at a cheaper price in America anymore because of these tariffs. We're going to produce in America for American citizens only, the American consumer only, because we're not going to be able to export because of the price of steel and the price of labor. So it won't affect you that much. Now it might cost them not hiring as much because they do lose access to the United States market, but they still have the whole global consumer, the whole foreign buyer to sell to. Therefore, and that proves my point too, is where I'm saying in order for manufacturing to boom like it's doing in Mexico now is because they have the foreign buyers. They lose access to the United States market, and we are the world's biggest consumer, but it's not going to affect their plant that much and their jobs that much, if at all, because they still have the whole foreign buyer in the rest of the world because their labor is so cheap, because their standards of living hasn't risen that much. They can work in some areas for $20 a day, and that's a great living. Can't do that in the United States. We've lost our manufacturing base largely be part of that. Now, some of it is greed and some of the things on the news, but it has a lot to do with the Cantillon Effect. So that's why I think you should understand the Cantillon Effect and Gresham's Law and Triffin's Dilemma and all of that, because it helps you understand things like the bond market. It helps you understand just investing in general. So that's just what I got for you today. Working man investor, keep grinding, people.